be noted. I call the member for Charlton.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome our guests as well. I rise to take note of the motion by the then Trade Minister regarding the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the largest preferential trade deal. I won't call it a free trade deal. It is the biggest preferential trade deal this world has seen, covering 800 million people and, from memory, about 40% of global trade. So it's a very significant trade agreement. The question that this parliament should resolve through the Treaties Committee and ultimately through Parliament is it merely a standardisation of trade access? Is it opening up freer trade for the 800 million people that live in those economies covered by it? Is that the reason we're doing it? Is that the outcome, standardisation of things like rules of origin, investor-state procedures, harmonisation of rules of content? Or is it more about advancing, strengthening monopoly rights over intellectual property and strengthening the rights of foreign corporations to sue sovereign governments? I suspect the answer, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a bit of both. Mr Deputy Speaker. And that's, I think, one of the difficulties pertaining to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that is there is some well and truly beneficial things in this trade agreement. There's no doubt that it will improve the lives of some of the poorest people in the world. There is no doubt about that. But there's also certainly plenty of ugly things in the agreement that this parliament should scrutinise carefully, because this trade agreement does impugn and does reduce the sovereignty of this parliament to make laws in the interests of the Australian people. And the question that we always have to resolve here, Mr Deputy Speaker, is slightly more trade access for our agricultural exports and our service sector worth that sovereignty being reduced? And I'm not sure what the answer is, to be clear, Deputy Speaker. Some of the most egregious parts of this trade agreement go to investor-state dispute settlement clauses, ISDS, which my colleague, the member for Griffith, alluded to and went to some detail about. But I will simply say that any clauses in free trade agreements that have been cautioned against, that have been criticised by the Productivity Commission, by the High Court of Australia through the Chief Justice, are things to be worried about. The Productivity Commission and the High Court aren't organisations traditionally renowned as being mad rabbit left-wing anti-trade organisations. Yet both organisations, the Chief Justice and the Productivity Commission, have cautioned against investor-state dispute settlement clauses. As the former Speaker talked about, there is no market failure that ISDS is seeking to solve. There is not a market failure that justifies giving foreign corporations greater rights than domestic corporations to sue the Australian government. And we saw Philip Morris's ultimately unsuccessful, thankfully, but ultimately their pursuit of our plain packaging laws through an obscure Hong Kong arm of their organisation, because their Australian arm had already tried the case and lost in the High Court, Mr Deputy Speaker. So it's an incredibly worrying clause. It's a clause that impugns the sovereignty of this parliament to make laws for the betterment of all Australians. And I'm concerned about the expansion of ISDS in this agreement, and I'm concerned about the safeguard provisions contained in this, because often when trade ministers, in particular the member for Goldstein, says there are safeguards, when you look at the detail, they are sorely lacking. So I looked at the agreement, and in the national interest submission put together by DFAT that accompanies the actual treaty, it says that there are safeguards around government's ability to provide social services to the people. And it goes into some detail in a paragraph around health and education and other measures. But it's unclear whether those social services, for example, cover the ability of this parliament to make laws around climate change, to restrict carbon pollution that is increasing global warming. Is that a social service that is safeguarded under the ISDS provisions, or does a foreign corporation have the ability to challenge climate change laws made by a future parliament. And Mr Deputy Speaker, that's a great concern. Another concern is, does the TPP expand monopoly intellectual property rights that give a greater length and greater powers for IP holders? Because we are an IP importer in this country. We pay more to IP holders overseas than we gain in revenue from the rest of the world on IP. And IP is an important economic provision, but ultimately it's providing a rent to corporations that have developed intellectual property. And that rent is necessary to drive innovation, but it should be kept to a minimum because ultimately it reduces the welfare of economies by providing a rent to corporations. Deputy Speaker, there are other concerns in this agreement, particularly labour rights. Labour rights in the TPP were once promised to provide full safeguards around ILO conventions to signatory nations, but if you look at the actual agreement, it appears that the only commitment is to implement nations' own labour laws, not recognised international standards. And if this is true, Deputy Speaker, this is very worrying because the agreement refers to the ILO declaration, the International Labour Organisation declaration, but it doesn't appear to actually reference the core ILO conventions that guarantee an access to collective bargaining, to the right to organise and form a trade union, to not have forced labour. So, Deputy Speaker, if the only protections is to the ILO declaration and to the nation's own labour laws, which can be reduced at any time by a parliament of that nation, then we won't have countries in the TPP who currently allow forced labour, that currently don't have free trade unions, that currently don't guarantee the right to collectively bargain, which are recognised human rights through the ILO conventions. This TPP does not advance that cause one jot, Deputy Speaker, and that gives me pause for concern. Around labour movement, my information is that this agreement removes labour market testing within Australia for temporary skilled visas for another 5 nations covered by the TPP. This is concerning because, again, any time we look at using temporary skilled migration without guaranteeing absolutely that there is an Australian that can do that job is of great concern. Around environmental commitments within the agreement, Mr Deputy Speaker, at the start and during the process, we were promised that there will be enforceable commitments to at least 7 international environmental agreements. But the text mentions only 4 environmental agreements, and there is only one that has clearly enforceable commitments, and that's around trade in endangered species. And, Deputy Speaker, that's an important treaty, but there are 6 other international environmental agreements that are lacking, and there isn't a single mention of climate change, which is, quite frankly, the greatest economic and environmental challenge the nation is facing at the moment. So to have a trade agreement that covers 40% of global trade and 800 million people, not mentioning climate change, is a concern. Provisions around pharmaceuticals are also a worry. Whether they stymie access for affordable medicines to 800 million people, particularly in the poorest nations, is a concern. And there still is considerable uncertainty around biologics, Mr Deputy Speaker. We were promised that there would only be a 5-year protection for biologics, but in the actual text it states it's either 8 years or 5 years plus an equivalent of a further 3 years, which seems very wishy-washy to me, Deputy Speaker. It's either 5 years or it's 8 years. It can't be both at the same time. But the United States negotiators are saying it's 8. The member for Goldstein, the previous Trade Minister, is saying it's 5. And if it is 8, that is of great concern. So, Deputy Speaker, in summing up, if this trade agreement is mostly about standardising country of origin, standardising labelling, standardising content rules, reducing tariff access for our agricultural exports, and giving service providers a chance to crack markets, then it's a good thing. However, if it's about impugning the sovereignty of this parliament, if it's about extending the IP monopoly rights, if it doesn't provide decent labour rights protections, if it doesn't provide enforceable environmental protections, then this is a substandard agreement that this parliament should scrutinise carefully, as our US colleagues are doing right now, because, Deputy Speaker, this trade agreement will have a real impact on this nation, and I, for one, hope it will be positive rather than negative. Thank you very much.